Older woman humiliated at the bank. The staff freeze when Denzel Washington arrives and take over. Evelyn Rogers stepped into the marble-floored, high-end banking hall, her worn shoes tapping lightly against the polished surface. She clutched the strap of her purse tighter, adjusting the thick cardigan around her frail shoulders. The cool air inside contrasted sharply with the humid heat she had just walked through outside. She didn't belong here. She knew it, and she felt it with every step. But she had no other choice. The charity fund she managed for her late friend's cause needed the deposit, and the bank was the only place that could process it. Her heart was racing as she surveyed the modern surroundings. Glass walls gleamed with an artificial brightness, the air tinged with the scent of freshly polished furniture. The few clients sitting around the spacious waiting area barely looked up from their phones, their faces a study in indifference, as if the world beyond the luxurious bank had no impact on them. The tellers behind their gleaming counters wore pristine suits, as though they were dressed for a job more important than just managing finances. Before we get into the story, comment below where you are watching from today. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Evelyn wasn't sure why she had thought this would be easy. Her clothes were modest, clearly well-worn, and her face carried the weight of her years, each line a reminder of the hard life she'd lived. She had no problem with being an older woman, but she couldn't ignore the way the younger generation seemed to look at her. She knew she wasn't invisible to them. She just didn't think she would be treated like this. She approached the counter slowly, her gaze fixed on the young woman standing behind it. The teller, no older than 22, was busy typing something into the computer, her fingers moving fast, almost too fast to be careful. Evelyn hesitated before clearing her throat gently. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The teller didn't respond at first, her eyes never leaving the screen. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for a friendly welcome, a smile, some acknowledgement of her presence. But instead, she was met with silence. After what felt like an eternity, the teller looked up, an uninterested expression on her face. "Yes?" she asked curtly, clearly not happy to be interrupted. Evelyn's hand trembled as she took out a small folder containing the deposit paperwork. "I need to make a deposit for the charity fund of my late friend, Miss Clara Thompson. I've been managing it for a while now," she explained, her voice shaking just a bit more than she intended. The teller looked at the folder briefly, her eyes scanning the paperwork with little interest, then back up at Evelyn. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with a slight sneer, "but this section is for clients only. You can't loiter here." She paused for a moment, her gaze flicking to Evelyn's worn clothes, before continuing. "I'll have to ask you to leave if you don't have an appointment." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She began, but the teller had already turned back to her computer, as if Evelyn had ceased to exist. Before Evelyn could gather her thoughts, the teller raised her voice sharply. "Security," she called out loudly, the words slicing through the air like a cold knife. The customers around the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes now drawn to Evelyn, who felt a deep flush creeping up her neck. Her hands shook, clutching the folder tighter as if it might shield her from the humiliation that was unfolding in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The looks she received, those judgmental stares, burned into her skin. She had worked so hard her entire life, done everything she could to make sure that Clara's legacy lived on, and now, she was being tossed out like an unwanted piece of trash. Her vision blurred for a second as tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. The security guard approached slowly, a tall, imposing figure, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of indifference and slight irritation. "Ma'am," he said, his tone impersonal, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the private banking section." I'm not loitering," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have business here. I was told to make this deposit in person." The security guard didn't respond to her plea, only nodded toward the door. "You'll have to step outside, ma'am." Evelyn's heart sank. She glanced around, looking for a lifeline, but found nothing but cold stares. The customers in the waiting area continued to mind their own business, clearly unfazed by what was happening. Evelyn felt the walls closing in around her. This wasn't supposed to be her reality. She wasn't a beggar. She wasn't a nuisance. But in that moment, she felt like both. The security guard's hand rested on her elbow, urging her toward the door, and Evelyn walked in stunned silence. The door opened with a soft whoosh, letting in the stifling heat of the outside world. It felt like stepping into another life, one where she wasn't respected, where she didn't matter. But as she stood there in the threshold, feeling small and insignificant, something unexpected happened. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and a powerful voice broke through the tension in the air. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Evelyn froze, her eyes snapping toward the source of the voice. Denzel Washington strode through the door, his tall frame unmistakable. His presence commanded the room instantly, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made everyone stop and listen. The security guard froze, clearly surprised by his sudden appearance. Evelyn could hardly believe her eyes. Was this some kind of joke? A movie set? She hadn't seen Denzel Washington in person before, but it didn't take a starstruck fan to recognize him. He was standing in front of her now, his expression unreadable. Evelyn could barely breathe as she tried to process what was happening. But Denzel wasn't just any actor. He was a man who had walked through fire and come out on the other side. And now, he was standing before her. He turned to the security guard, his voice firm. "Is there a problem with this woman being here?" he asked. The security guard, caught off guard by Denzel's sudden arrival, stammered. "Sir, there's no problem, just, she doesn't belong in this section." Denzel's gaze sharpened, his eyes boring into the guard with a quiet intensity that made the air between them thicken. "She doesn't belong? You've got that wrong," he said, his tone low but powerful. He stepped closer to Evelyn, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "This woman is not just some random person," Denzel continued, his voice steady but with a note of steel. "She's my late mother's best friend. She's a woman who helped raise me when my mom couldn't. And if she's not good enough for your bank, then neither is my money." The room went deathly quiet. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The security guard, Jamie, and the few remaining customers were frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. And in that silence, Evelyn's heart thudded loudly in her chest. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some fleeting moment of celebrity fascination. Denzel Washington, the man she had only ever seen on the big screen, was here, standing right next to her, making it clear to the entire room that she was important. The silence in the room stretched on, hanging thick in the air like an unspoken question. Evelyn stood frozen beside Denzel, her mind racing, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. She could hardly comprehend it. She had been dismissed so easily, so quickly, as if she were invisible. And now, standing beside a man she had only ever seen on a screen, a man whose very presence commanded authority, she felt a strange mix of awe and disbelief. The staff behind the counter remained still, like statues. The young teller, Jamie, still had his eyes locked on Denzel, but there was no defiance in his gaze anymore. Gone was the confident posture that had moments ago been so eager to throw Evelyn out. Instead, Jamie seemed to shrink under the weight of Denzel's stare. The power in the room had shifted entirely, and for the first time that day, Evelyn felt something other than humiliation. She felt seen. Denzel's gaze never left the young teller. His eyes, dark and intense, were filled with a quiet storm. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding in the way one might expect. No, Denzel's power was in the calmness of his words, in the deliberate, unwavering strength he projected without even raising his voice. "I'm here to make a deposit," Denzel said, turning slightly to address the rest of the room. His voice carried, low but full of undeniable authority. "A deposit of $2 million, to be exact. And I'll be depositing it in this woman's name." A murmur rippled through the room. The customers, until now barely aware of the confrontation, turned their heads toward Denzel. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, but this time, it was different. They weren't looking at her with judgment. Instead, they were watching with curiosity, uncertainty, perhaps even admiration. Denzel's voice cut through the air again, sharp as a blade. "You just kicked out the woman who raised me when my mother couldn't. She's been more of a mother to me than you could ever imagine. And if she's not good enough for your bank, neither is my money." There was a moment of stunned silence. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't the same nervous beat she had felt moments ago. Now, There was a sense of validation, a strange mix of gratitude and astonishment. She had known Denzel. In a way, his movies had been a constant in her life. But this was something she could never have imagined in her wildest dreams. The manager, Maggie Parker, hurried over from the far side of the room, her heels clicking nervously on the polished floor. She was a woman in her mid-30s, well-groomed, dressed in an immaculate suit. But now, as she stood before Denzel and Evelyn, there was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that the situation was beyond her control. "Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding," Maggie began, her voice flustered but professional. "We'll rectify this immediately. There must be some mistake." Denzel didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on Jamie, the teller, whose face had gone pale. The young man swallowed hard, trying to find words, but nothing came. There was nothing left to say. He had overstepped, and now the consequences were clear. Denzel wasn't just a celebrity. He was a man with power, with influence, and he was using it to stand up for someone who had been wronged. "You should have shown respect," Denzel said, his voice low but firm. "But instead, you chose to make her feel like she didn't belong." He shook his head, his disappointment evident. "That's not how things work in the world I come from. You don't get to decide who's worthy of respect based on the way they look or the way they dress. That's not your job." Jamie opened his mouth, but no words came out. The realization hit him all at once. He had made a grave mistake. But there was no way to take it back now. The damage had been done. "Please, sir," Maggie said, her voice pleading. "Let's not escalate this any further. I'll make sure everything is handled. I'll personally take care of it." Denzel didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned to Evelyn, offering her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Evelyn. This will be handled." Evelyn, still reeling from the shock of the moment, couldn't find words. She simply nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. She had never expected something like this. Never thought that a day at the bank would turn into a scene from one of Denzel's movies. And yet, here she was, standing beside the man himself, and the bank staff were scrambling to make things right. "Take a seat," Denzel said softly to her, motioning toward the comfortable chairs in the lounge area. "I'll take care of the rest." Evelyn nodded again, still in a daze as she made her way to the chairs, her legs shaky from the intensity of everything that had transpired. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but this time, it didn't matter. Denzel had just changed the entire dynamic of the situation. She felt a sense of power, a sense of being truly seen for the first time today. Maggie, her face flushed with embarrassment, turned to the security guard and signaled for him to escort Jamie out. The young man moved slowly, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of his mistake on his back. As he passed by Denzel, there was a brief moment of eye contact, and for the first time, Jamie seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had done. "Your apology isn't enough," Denzel said quietly, just loud enough for Jamie to hear. "But it's a start." Jamie's face reddened further, but he didn't respond. He simply followed the security guard toward the exit, his head bowed. Denzel's attention returned to Maggie, who had been standing silently, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I want the deposit made now," he said. "And I want Evelyn treated with the respect she deserves. No more delays." Maggie nodded quickly, her face a mix of relief and anxiety. She motioned to a nearby staff member to begin processing the transaction, and within moments, Evelyn's paperwork was pulled from the pile and handed over to the teller at a neighboring counter. Denzel stood with Evelyn, ensuring that she wasn't left alone, and the two watched as the transaction was completed without further incident. Evelyn's mind raced as she processed everything that had happened. She had been humiliated, thrown out like a piece of trash, and then, in the blink of an eye, her life had been upended. She was no longer just a woman with a small charity deposit. She was the person who had Denzel Washington standing up for her, the person who had been shown respect when she thought all hope had been lost. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Denzel smiled warmly at her. "You don't need to say anything. I've got your back, Evelyn." Denzel's presence still lingered in the room like an unshakable force. The bank had gone back to its usual rhythm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The murmurs of the customers had died down, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. Maggie stood behind the counter, anxiously watching as the staff worked, processing the deposit for Evelyn with a speed that seemed driven by more than just efficiency. It was driven by a need to correct a wrong. Evelyn sat in the private lounge area, her fingers resting nervously on the edge of her seat. Her pulse was still quick, her breath shallow, and though she had managed to compose herself on the outside, inside she was still reeling. She had been an ordinary woman, managing her late friend's charity fund without ever thinking that one day she would be at the center of such an extraordinary spectacle. She glanced up as Denzel approached, his footsteps confident, measured, but not hurried. His tall frame cast a shadow across the lounge as he stopped in front of her, his expression calm and reassuring. "You good?" he asked, his voice gentle but steady. Evelyn nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she finally found her voice. I don't know what to say. This has been too much." Denzel smiled, taking a seat across from her. His eyes softened with empathy, though his posture remained commanding. "You don't have to say anything. Just take a moment to breathe. This is your space now." She nodded again, her mind slowly beginning to settle. In the few minutes since the confrontation, everything had changed. The weight of the world felt different, lighter, as though something had shifted in the atmosphere. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn didn't feel invisible. She felt powerful, and she wasn't sure how to process it, but the sense of being seen and respected was something she had longed for, even if she hadn't realized it. Denzel looked over at Maggie, who was still standing by the counter, nervously biting her lip. The bank manager seemed to be caught between gratitude and fear, clearly aware of the magnitude of what had just transpired. She was trying to make herself appear calm, composed, but it was obvious that the events had shaken her more than she was letting on. Denzel's gaze turned back to Evelyn, and he leaned forward slightly. "This bank needs to understand something," he said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "You're not just some random person, Evelyn, and you sure as hell aren't invisible. You're a woman who's been through more than most people will ever understand. You deserve respect." Evelyn swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She had spent so much of her life in the shadows, helping others without ever expecting recognition. But Denzel's words, his unwavering support, made her realize something she hadn't allowed herself to believe for years. She was worthy of respect, too. Before she could respond, Maggie hurried over to the lounge, her footsteps quick and almost frantic. Her expression was one of apprehension, but there was something else behind it, determination. She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself before she spoke. "Mr. Washington, Evelyn, I wanted to apologize," Maggie said, her voice sincere, though tinged with nervousness. "I don't know what came over Jamie. This isn't the way we conduct business here, and I want to make sure something like this never happens again. We've already started processing the deposit. It will be handled immediately." Denzel nodded, his expression unwavering. "Good. But this isn't just about processing a deposit. It's about making sure Evelyn and anyone else who comes through here is treated with dignity and respect." Maggie took another step forward, her eyes wide. "Of course, sir. Absolutely. We'll be doing a review of our staff's training. This incident, it's unacceptable. We'll do everything in our power to ensure something like this never happens again." Denzel held her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if reading her. "This isn't just about apologizing, Maggie. It's about action. If you truly believe in respect and equality, you need to show it, not just say it. Words don't mean much when they're not backed up by real change." Evelyn could see the weight of Denzel's words sinking in, and she knew he wasn't just speaking for her. He was speaking for anyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. His tone was calm, but there was an undeniable power behind it, a power that came from experience, from understanding the value of human dignity. Maggie nodded again, her hands trembling slightly. "We'll do what we can. I promise you that." She turned toward Evelyn, offering a hesitant smile. I'm so sorry for what happened. We truly value every client, and I want to make this right." Evelyn wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't used to being the center of attention in such a way, and part of her still felt as though this entire situation was unreal. But as she looked at Denzel, standing beside her like a protector, something inside her shifted. She felt safe, and she felt empowered. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was a man who understood, who had experienced the kind of pain that came from being overlooked and dismissed. He wasn't just helping her in the moment. He was helping her find her voice. "I appreciate your apology," Evelyn said softly, her voice steady now. "And I appreciate everything you've done for me. But the real change, like Denzel said, comes from how you act moving forward." Maggie nodded again, her face softening as she took a deep breath. "You're absolutely right, Evelyn. We'll make sure of it." Denzel gave a slight nod of approval, then turned back to Evelyn. "You know, Evelyn," he said with a small smile, "it's not about having money or status. It's about how you treat people. And the people who matter most are the ones who lift each other up." Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at him. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make an impact, but standing there, with Denzel's words ringing in her ears, she felt as if she were standing on solid ground for the first time in years. As the minutes passed, the deposit was processed, and the tension in the air began to lift. Maggie, still a bit shaken but now more determined, began to make plans for internal training to ensure that all employees were educated about respect, empathy, and equality. She was already working on re-establishing the trust that had been shattered, one step at a time. Denzel, ever the quiet force of nature, stood beside Evelyn as they watched the transaction complete. There was no fanfare, no grand speeches. Just a quiet moment of acknowledgement that Evelyn's dignity had been restored. Evelyn looked up at him, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Denzel. You didn't have to do this, but you did, and I'll never forget it." The bank, once filled with an air of judgment, now felt like a different world. The atmosphere had shifted from cold indifference to palpable tension, a reminder that the dynamics between people could be fragile, even in the most professional of settings. As Evelyn sat in the lounge, waiting for the final details of her deposit to be processed, she couldn't help but reflect on the events that had just unfolded. She had gone from being a woman dismissed and humiliated to someone who was now at the center of an unexpected confrontation, one that had reverberated through the very walls of the bank. She looked over at Denzel, who was speaking softly to Maggie. His presence was calming, as always, but there was an intensity about him now. An intensity that Evelyn hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just about being famous. It wasn't even about the money. Denzel wasn't standing up for her because of some celebrity status or because of the deposit he was making. He was standing up for her because it was the right thing to do. She had always known that the world could be cruel, that people could be unkind, especially to those who didn't fit the mold of what society considered worthy. But in that moment, she felt like she had been shown a new truth. The world wasn't just cruel. It could also be redeemed, one act of kindness, one gesture of respect, one powerful moment at a time. Denzel's conversation with Maggie came to an end, and he turned back toward Evelyn, offering her a reassuring smile. Maggie had apologized profusely, and Denzel had held firm in his demand for real change. He had made it clear that the bank's reputation was at stake, and that if they truly valued their clients, they needed to show it, not just in words, but in actions. He had also told Maggie that the next time Evelyn came into the bank, she should be treated as the valued client she was, not as someone to be dismissed based on her appearance. But as Denzel sat down beside Evelyn, his expression softened. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low and full of concern. Evelyn looked at him, still in disbelief. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never expected something like this to happen. I never thought someone would stand up for me like that. It's just so much." Denzel nodded, his gaze steady. "I get it. But what you need to understand is that you matter. No matter what anyone else says or does, you matter. You've been giving your time, your energy, your heart to something that's bigger than yourself. And that's something worth standing up for." Evelyn's chest tightened as his words sank in. She had spent so many years doing what she thought was right, managing Clara's charity, trying to make a difference in her own small way. But it had always felt like a thankless job, one that had never garnered much attention. She had been used to working in the shadows, behind the scenes, with no expectation of recognition. But today, everything had changed. Denzel's actions had made her realize that she didn't need to hide in the shadows anymore. She had a voice, and that voice could make a difference. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for showing me that I have a voice. Denzel smiled, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You've always had one. Sometimes, it just takes a little help to be heard. The door to the lounge opened, and Maggie stepped inside, looking both apologetic and determined. She walked over to them, her expression now one of genuine concern. Evelyn, she began, her tone soft. I wanted to let you know that the board has already been notified about what happened. We're taking immediate steps to ensure that all staff undergo a thorough review and additional training. No one should ever feel the way you did today. We're implementing new policies, starting with an overhaul of our customer service approach. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She studied Maggie's face, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that the woman was just saying what needed to be said to smooth things over. But what she saw was genuine. Maggie seemed genuinely remorseful, genuinely committed to making things right. I appreciate that, Evelyn said, her voice steady now. But words aren't enough. Actions speak louder. Maggie nodded, taking a deep breath. I know. That's why we're taking real action. We'll be setting up a meeting with the staff later today to discuss the changes, and I'll make sure you're kept updated on everything. Evelyn's gaze softened, and she gave a slight nod. That's all I ask. I'm not here for some apology. I want change. I want things to be better for everyone, not just for me. Denzel leaned back in his seat, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He didn't say anything, but it was clear he agreed with Evelyn's sentiment. He had made it clear to Maggie that this wasn't just about righting the wrong that had been done to Evelyn. It was about making sure that no one else would ever have to experience the same humiliation. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again, Maggie said, her voice firm now. And I'll be doing everything I can to personally ensure that these changes are implemented effectively. Denzel stood, offering Evelyn a hand to help her to her feet. Let's get you out of here, Evelyn. You've got a charity to run, and I'm sure there's more work to be done. Evelyn stood, still feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders, but also feeling something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As they made their way out of the lounge, Maggie followed them to the door. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, she said, her voice sincere. And again, I'm so sorry for everything. Denzel gave her a nod, acknowledging her apology, but making it clear that there was still work to be done. We'll see you soon, he said, turning toward the exit with Evelyn. The two of them walked out of the bank, the sunlight greeting them as they stepped back into the real world. The events of the day would remain etched in Evelyn's memory, but she felt a sense of peace knowing that the power of kindness and respect had triumphed, at least for today. Denzel glanced over at her as they walked, his expression thoughtful. You know, Evelyn, sometimes it takes a little disruption to make real change happen. And today, we caused a big disruption. Evelyn chuckled softly, her heart lighter than it had been all day. I don't think anyone will forget this anytime soon. No, Denzel agreed, they won't. And that's a good thing. Sometimes, you've got to make a little noise to be heard. Evelyn looked up at him, her gratitude still evident in her eyes. I can't thank you enough. You've changed my life today. Denzel smiled, his eyes twinkling. You're the one who's doing the real work, Evelyn. I'm just here to help you get the respect you deserve. The success of the community outreach event had marked a turning point not just for Evelyn, but for the bank as well. The attention had shifted from the incident that had occurred to the positive strides the bank was now making in its diversity and inclusion efforts. The press conference that followed was both a culmination of those efforts and a spotlight on Evelyn herself. She had come a long way from the woman who had walked into the bank that fateful day, humiliated and unsure of her place in the world. Maggie had called her a few days earlier, asking her to attend the press conference. At first, Evelyn had been hesitant. She wasn't one to seek attention, and the thought of being thrust into the limelight made her nervous. But Denzel had encouraged her to go, reminding her that her story had power and that it could inspire others. Sometimes you have to step into the light, Evelyn, he had said. You've earned it. Evelyn had taken his words to heart. She was no longer the woman who had let herself be overlooked. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had become a catalyst for change. She couldn't hide from that now. She had a responsibility to see this through, to show others that they, too, had the power to make a difference. The press conference was held in a large, sleek conference room at the bank's headquarters. The walls were adorned with banners highlighting the bank's new initiatives, and the room was filled with cameras, reporters, and key figures from the community. Maggie stood at the front, preparing for her speech, while Evelyn sat quietly at a table off to the side, feeling the weight of the moment. As she looked around the room, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She had never been a part of something like this before. The media attention, the prominent figures in the room, it was all so overwhelming. But she knew she had a role to play, a story to tell. The event began with a brief introduction from Maggie, who stood confidently at the podium. She addressed the gathered press, highlighting the bank's commitment to diversity, community outreach, and its new programs designed to support underrepresented communities. She spoke with pride, but there was a sense of urgency in her tone, as if the events of the past month had been a wake-up call for everyone involved. We are here today to showcase the efforts we've made to ensure that our services are available to all individuals, regardless of their background, and that we treat each and every client with the dignity and respect they deserve, Maggie said, her voice strong. What we've learned from the recent events is that we must do better, not just in our policies, but in our actions. And we are committed to making that change. Evelyn sat quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been invited to speak, but she wasn't sure if she was ready. The spotlight felt so intense, and her nerves threatened to take over. She glanced over at Denzel, who was seated at the back of the room, his calm presence grounding her. He gave her a subtle nod of encouragement, and it was enough to steady her. Maggie continued her speech, but Evelyn's focus was on what was to come. She knew she needed to share her story, to speak the truth of what had happened and what it had meant for her. It wasn't just about the bank's apology. It was about the lessons learned, the change that had begun, and the people who had been affected along the way. When the time came for Evelyn to speak, Maggie called her up to the podium. The room went silent as all eyes turned to her. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping up to the microphone. "Thank you, Maggie," Evelyn began, her voice clear but nervous. I never imagined I'd be standing here today. A few weeks ago, I walked into this bank, hoping to make a simple deposit for a charity I've been working with for years. But instead, I was humiliated. I was dismissed, treated like I didn't belong. And I almost walked away without a word, thinking that maybe this was just the way the world worked. She paused, glancing around the room. She could see the reporters' pens poised, the cameras trained on her. But something inside her shifted. The nervousness began to fade as she remembered Denzel's words, as she remembered the power she had found in standing up for herself. But then something happened. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Someone stood up for me. Someone who didn't need to do it, but did anyway. Denzel Washington, a man I'd never met, stepped into that bank and said enough. He didn't just stand up for me. He stood up for what's right. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I never was. The room remained silent, but there was a sense of connection in the air now. Evelyn felt herself growing bolder with every word. "That day changed me," she said. "It wasn't just about the bank or the deposit. It was about the respect I thought I'd lost. It was about the dignity we all deserve. And I'm here today to say that no one, no matter their age, their background, or their appearance, should ever be treated the way I was." A wave of applause swept through the room. Evelyn felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest, but she fought to keep her composure. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the message she was sharing, the message that needed to be heard. "What happened that day isn't just about what happened to me," she continued. "It's about all of us. It's about the people who go unseen, the people who are ignored, the people who are told they don't matter. We all have a story to tell, and we all deserve to be heard." Evelyn paused, taking a deep breath as she looked out over the room. "I want to thank the bank for listening. I want to thank Maggie and everyone here who's working to make real change. But most of all, I want to thank Denzel for reminding me that I do matter, for reminding all of us that we have the power to make a difference." There was another round of applause, but this time, Evelyn wasn't just feeling the weight of the moment. She felt the power of it. She wasn't just a woman who had been humiliated and dismissed. She was a woman who had been heard. And her voice, her story, was now a part of the larger conversation about respect, dignity, and change. After the press conference, the room buzzed with reporters asking questions, but Evelyn's focus was elsewhere. Denzel was waiting for her near the back of the room, a proud smile on his face. "You did great," he said as she walked toward him. Evelyn couldn't help but smile in return. "I don't know if I could have done it without you." Denzel shook his head, his smile widening. "You've always had it in you, Evelyn. You just needed someone to remind you of that." As they left the conference room together, Evelyn felt the weight of the day settle into something that felt like peace. This was her moment, not just because of the recognition, but because she had finally realized that the fight for respect was never over, it was ongoing. And she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for others who still needed their voices heard.